It's time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the Property Podcast. I'm Rob B. With me is Rob D. This is episode 64. I think it's going to be a good one. Stick with us. Hey Rob, how are you?
Really well, thank you. Yet this week we're actually covering what I think might just be the two most popular topics in the Property Hub, rather than the topics where questions come up the most often. We're talking about mortgages, and our resource of the week is about taxation. They might not sound that exciting, but they do throw up a hell of a lot of questions. So we're going to be covering those. And in our news story, we're going to be talking about something else that's all over the news at the moment, which is runaway rents.
Okay, so let's get this episode up and running. I'm going to start with the reviews. First up is Monk Lad, and he says, great podcast. Amazing podcast, packed full of useful information. Ticks all the boxes a property podcast should. I can't seem to find the first 4 episodes though. Where can I download these from? Well, Monklad, you can go to our website and you can go through all the back episodes there if you can't find them on iTunes.
But please don't. The first 4 weren't our best.
No. Yeah, actually, there's probably a reason iTunes have removed them due to poor quality. Next, Bob's says, outstanding. I've been hooked on the podcast since the first episode I listened to, and I'm so glad I found it. As a student studying property, it not only offers me some first-rate options on the trends of the market, but it's also had a big impact on my attitude towards future investments and life planning. The presenters are top draw. Both really know what they're talking about. These guys will take you from step 1 to step done in your pursuit of becoming a successful property investor and business owner. Thanks, guys. Keep up the great work. Thank you very much. And finally, Denzelia says, best podcast. During my journeys to work, I normally listen to music, but I've started to listen to the Property Podcast every week without fail. Rob and Rob, actually I like this. It says Robert and Rob, I wonder which one's which. Give clear, valuable advice. They're very knowledgeable and make technical things easy to understand. Keep up the great work, lads. I can continue to make my journeys to work insightful. And at the end it says Dennis. There we go. So thank you, Dennis. So which one's Robert and which one's Rob? Please let us know, Dennis. I'm keen to find out. And why? Okay, so while we leave that for another week, Rob, the news this week, runaway rents. This is really interesting. It's not really what's been reported. This news story seems to take a different viewpoint, and rightly so, it seems.
So everyone's talking about these runaway rents, and maybe we should have a rent cap, and maybe we should have all these controls around it. But in fact, according to a study by LSL Property Services, which is reported in This Is Money, the average rent has risen by only £5 in the last 12 months. So the average rent in the UK is now £741 a month, and it was £736. So no big change there. But also, if you go back a bit further, according to this study, rents have actually fallen in real terms over the last 4 years as well. So as of this April, rents were 12.9% higher than they were in January 2010. But consumer price index inflation since then is 14.5%. So rents have actually fallen in real terms. Now, this doesn't take account of regional variations. Maybe there are going to be places where rents have rushed away, maybe in the southeast. But I think the overall point here is that it seems like all this talk about rents being out of control just isn't true. And I think that probably bears out a lot of landlords' personal experience as well. I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, well, where are these rents that have got out of control? Because mine are the same as they've ever been.
Yeah, it's interesting. Is it just political grandstanding and, making a fuss over nothing? Or is there a genuine problem? The article says there's not an issue. Go and have a look. There's a lot of numbers there that we just, thrown at you in a very short space of time. So we'll link to the article in the show notes. I actually don't think rent controls will come in. I think that's the headline, and what will happen if Labour win power is there'll be a watered-down version, which is often the way with politics. They tell you the extreme and they deliver something less. What's the saying? Over-promise and under-deliver. I sound like such a cynic. I'm sure, though, they try their best. But anyway, before we talk about politics, Rob, I think we should move into our topic of the week, because this is a good one, so let's give it the time it deserves.
So the topic of the week is mortgages, tips, tricks, and things you need to know. So the show notes for this episode, where you can read the study that we've just talked about as well in full, is at thepropertyhub.net/mortgages. Nice and easy. We need to talk about this because, as I said at the top of the show, it is probably the topic on the Property Hub that gets the most questions around it. And it is really important. You know that we're big fans of leverage if you've listened to the show before. We make that clear enough. We're not going to talk about the benefits of that again today because I think we've talked about that plenty. But taking on leverage, taking on a mortgage is a really big decision, and there's a lot to consider. Unless you're particularly unlucky with repair costs, a mortgage is probably going to be far and away your biggest expense. So it's important to get it right. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about some of the things that you need to take into consideration when taking out a mortgage.
Okay, so let's have a look at this. So one of the questions I often get asked is, should I go for a fixed rate mortgage or a variable mortgage? Okay, so quick definition of both. Fixed rate is where you lock in the mortgage rate, and variable is it'll move as interest rates are moved up or down, more likely to be up in the future. And the reason why people ask is because a fixed rate gives you security. You know exactly where you stand for the period of the fixed rate. So you may have a 2-year discounted fixed rate or a 5-year. They tend to be the more popular, particularly the 2-year option. A variable means that you might get a slightly discounted rate compared to the fixed rate, but if the interest rates move up, so does your mortgage. So, therefore, fixed rate every time? Well, not so fast. Let's have a look at this. Let's say that you were looking at getting a mortgage of £100,000. Okay? A mortgage of £100,000. And the on-offer was a fixed rate, and let's just call it 5% interest only. You probably get better than that, but it's just to keep the numbers easy for me. So that means the interest you would pay over the year would be £5,000. Okay? And let's say the tracker was 4.5%. Okay? Discounted rate for 2 years. So you'd be paying an interest of £4,500. But as I've said, if the interest rates move up, then the tracker moves up, but the fixed rate, you know where you stand for the 2 years. A lot of people say, we'll go for the fixed rate. Well, let's look into this in a little bit more detail. In the next 2 years, do you think interest rates are going to go up? Hard to answer. Possibly, is what I'd say. It certainly could. What about the next 12 months? So of your 2-year period, are interest rates likely to move up in the next 12 months? I would say less likely. If you had to push me, I personally believe no, they won't in the next 12 months. They might, I might be wrong, anything could happen, but I don't believe they will. So if that's the case, let's say interest rates move up in year 2. So they do move up in the 2 years, but not for the first year. During the first year, if interest rates moved up 0.5%, okay, in year 2, the first year you've saved 500, and the second year you've broke even on the other 5%. And then the discount rates finish after 2 years anyway. So that tracker has really performed better than the fixed rate. A fixed rate for 2 years actually doesn't offer you that much security because 2 years comes and goes very, very quickly. So in most cases, I personally would go for the variable with the slightly discounted rate. So I hope that makes sense. There's a lot of numbers I've just thrown at you. Hopefully that all comes across well. Now, if that's the case, why don't you fix for 5 years? Well, this is the reason why you probably won't want to fix for 5 years. If you're in the process of building a portfolio and you're not just sitting tight, then 5 years is a long time to fix a mortgage because you may want to refinance that property within the 5 years. And I've seen people make the mistakes of fixing for 5 years on their first investment because they think it gives them security, and that's what the brokers recommended. When the brokers not dug deep enough to find out what they actually want, and they want to build a portfolio and release equity in the near future. So they're stuck, or they have to pay very high redemption penalty rates. So lots of information there on fixed and variable, but don't be drawn immediately to the fixed is the point I'm making. Dig deeper on the numbers, get the calculator out. Have a look at what you expect to happen. Interest rates in the next 12 months? I'd say no. I can't pay you back if I'm wrong, but equally I'm not going to ask for any money if I'm right. But that's just my personal view. So have a look at fixed versus variable and don't write off variable straight away because often it'll give you more flexibility and actually it may work out cheaper anyway.
Yeah, I think with fixed, it's always popular because you feel like you've got control and you know what's going to happen. But you said there that 2 years goes by very quickly, and that's very true. a lot of the time you've got this perceived safety, but you're going to have to deal with the interest rate environment in 2 years anyway. And another way of putting it is that banks have probably got more knowledge of future interest rates than you do. They're probably not going to be giving you any gifts in the fixed rate they give you. It's definitely something to look at. Okay, let's look at another important decision to make with the whole mortgage debate, which is interest only versus repayment. This is one we've talked about before, but it's worth talking about again because it is such an important decision to make. Now, we both prefer, Rob and I, interest only mortgages. And I'd say the majority of investors do as well. Why do we prefer it? Well, there are several reasons, but the main one is that because of inflation, if you just let the debt ride and you just pay off the interest, then in real terms, that debt is going to be shrinking every year because of inflation. You're going to end up paying off less in the end. Also, it improves the cash flow because you're not paying off any of the capital as you go along. You've got more money each month, which you can use to do whatever you want. So if you are looking to be expanding your portfolio, you can be saving up all that extra money you wouldn't otherwise have had, and you can reinvest it and put it down as a deposit for your next property. Now, some people prefer repayment mortgages, and they prefer them because their plan eventually is to pay down the debt, own their properties free and clear, and then maybe when they retire, they can live off the income generated by those properties without worrying about what's going to happen with interest rates or worry about getting mortgages into their old age. Maybe they just want to pass on an unencumbered portfolio to their children. That's why they prefer repayment mortgages. Normally, those are more popular among people who only want to have maybe one or two properties sort of as their pension plan, don't want to be doing any great expansion for reasons we've just talked about. Interest only improves your cash flow and everything else. But we do know a few big investors who are making acquisitions all the time and expanding who prefer to use repayment mortgages. Now, if you do want to use repayment, that's absolutely fine if that's what you want to do. But the thing that I always say to people is that just because you've got an interest-only mortgage doesn't mean that you're not allowed to pay down any of that debt if you want to. If you're accumulating this cash, because rather than making, say, a interest plus capital payment of £450, you're making an interest payment of £370, then you've got this £80 which you can save up every month. And you can do what you want with that. You can either invest it into another property, or if you want to, you can pay down chunks of your mortgage and reduce your debt. So what I'm saying is it gives you control. Rather than being locked into a repayment schedule that the bank has set, you can still repay whenever you want to, but it just means you're not locked into, and you can make decisions about whether to pay it down or not, depending on your circumstances at the time. It's not like your repayment schedule's been locked in at the outset for 25 years. But some people do just prefer to have the certainty of being on this schedule and knowing that they have to have it paid down by a certain date. So it's another one of those things where there's no right or wrong, but I'd go for interest only anytime.
Absolutely, Rob. I'm sold. I agree. Interest only every time. Now, if you want to dig deeper on the inflation that Rob touched on there and how that goes in your favour, you might want to check out episode 24. Inflation sounds like a dull topic, but actually it's one of the most important aspects to understand when it comes to property and how it can work in your favour. So go to episode 24. We'll link to it in the show notes, of course. So this episode you can find at thepropertyhub.net/mortgages, and we'll link to that episode there because it's well worth a listen. Okay, next up, fees. More importantly, watch out for those fees. A common mistake is people get drawn in by the headline rates. The banks are quite crafty. They'll throw what appears to be cheap rate out there to tempt you in, but when you actually dig into the detail, the amount it's going to cost you to take that mortgage would work out more expensive than paying a higher rate. And I'll explain. You could see a product at maybe 3.5% interest only, and there's plenty lower than that as well for buy-to-let mortgages. But you could be paying, in excess sometimes of £2,000 in arrangement fees, which is just ridiculous. £2,000 to get a mortgage, especially if your property, is worth less than, £200,000, then it ends up being a big percentage of what you're going to be paying. Be careful. Be very aware of the details. Look at all the numbers, not just the headline rate. For example, I know recently some of my clients have got mortgages from the NatWest, and they do no fees. They charge 4.3%, and speak to a broker. I'm not saying this is a rate that's out there today, but it certainly was in the last few weeks. 4.3% was the rate. So it looked slightly more expensive than a few others out there, but there was no fees. And when you worked out the numbers, it actually worked out cheaper to pay a slightly higher rate and have no fees than go for the lower rate with fees. So be careful. Don't be attracted by the headlines. Look at all the numbers and make a decision based on all the facts, not just the top numbers that you see.
So those are some of the decisions that you're going to have to make when taking out a mortgage. You're going to have to look at fees, you're going to have to look at fixed versus variable, and you're going to have to look at interest only versus repayment. But let's talk a little bit now about what's actually happening right now in the mortgage market and what we think might happen in the future. So if we talk about what's happening now, the big thing that everyone's talking about at the moment is the mortgage market review. And this is basically new regulation that's just come in that means that lenders are assessing affordability more rigorously. So it came in full a few weeks ago, although it's been happening gradually for a little while. It's important to say that this is only for residential lending. So buy-to-let lending is unregulated. So the mortgage market review, anything you've read about in the papers, and there's been a lot of stories about banks digging into affordability and saying that people are paying too much for their haircut so they can't get a mortgage and that kind of thing. None of that applies to buy-to-let. Because it's just happened, no one knows exactly how this is all going to play out. There is a chance that some of these new affordability rules will spill over with some lenders into buy-to-let. But I think that probably the biggest implication of the mortgage market review is that we're probably going to see lenders cracking down even more on people using buy-to-let mortgages to buy residential properties. In other words, it's harder to get a residential mortgage because it's all to do with affordability criteria and multiples of your salary and all that kind of thing. It's going to be even more tempting for people to try to get a buy-to-let mortgage, which is more to do with the rental income of the property, and say that they're going to be renting it out, but actually live in it. So that is mortgage fraud, and it's something that lenders are aware of and they do crack down on, but it's possible that we're going to see them cracking down on that even more. The implication of that is that often it's harder to get buy-to-let borrowing if you're not a homeowner. And one of the reasons for that is that they think, oh, you're trying to do something dodgy here, and you're actually just saying it's a buy-to-let, but actually you want to live in it. So I think one of the implications of the mortgage market review might be that we'll see lenders asking even more questions around that kind of thing. But the whole thing might be good for buy-to-let, because you're going to see lenders going, oh, this is just getting ridiculous now, trying to do residential lending. It's too much work. Let's focus more on buy-to-let. And that means that we're going to see more competition in the buy-to-let sector, which means more choice for us and better rates, lower fees, all that kind of thing. I mean, this is all speculation. This has only just happened. No one really knows what's going to happen. But overall, it seems like the net effect might be positive. We don't really know, but it's interesting to see how that's going to play out over the next 6 months or so.
You know, could the direct impact of this mean that less people can get on the property ladder? I don't think that's what the government intends, but could that be a direct consequence? If that's the case, then you're going to have people that are forced into rent again, which is what's happened up until recently. The Help to Buy has helped ease that. But will this then stop people from being able to buy in areas they want to live and therefore forced into renting? I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it is a good thing for investors, landlords. You really want people, if they can save and put money away, be able to get the homes they want, but it might end up having that consequence, which will then push up rents for investors, landlords. Generally, I'd say the mortgage market review, I can see why they want to do it. I'd say it's probably bad news for residential, generally, if you're looking to buy your own home, but probably good news if you're a buy-to-let investor. We shall see. It's hard to tell yet. We'll know more in 12 months and we can say, okay, this is what actually has happened. But it's going to be interesting to see what plays out. So talking about the future, let's look at the future and buy-to-let products in particular. So that's really what I want to cover at the end. I've talked about fixed rates of variables already. So some people would say, well, but Rob, interest rates will go up. And if I fix for 5 years, then I've got that security. Because when I go to get a product in 2 or 3 years' time, they're going to be more expensive. Not necessarily. Okay, let's have a look at the past before we go into the future. Before the credit crunch, interest rates were 5.5%, a bit higher, a bit lower. But at 5.5%, the average mortgage product was 5.75%. There wasn't that much difference between the interest rates and the buy-to-let products. Why? Well, it was competition. There were lots and lots of lenders in the market, all competing for your business. So the banks were willing to take a very small margin because they just wanted a piece of the pie. So if interest rates were, for example, 5.5%, banks were giving you products at 5.75%. Today, however, the interest rates are 0.5%, and the bank borrows just a little higher from that through the LIBOR. Now, if it's 0.5%, a year ago, the average buy-to-let product was around 5%. So they were making 4.5% in the margin. Huge margins. They've gone from 0.25% to 4.5%. So the banks were making loads of money from buy-to-let investors. Loads of money. Today, however, the average buy-to-let mortgage product's more like 4%. So interest rates haven't moved in the last 12 months, but the average product has dropped by about 1%. Why? Well, the reason why is increased competition. The property market has moved on. People are starting to feel more positive, and so are the banks. There are more lenders and more products than a year ago. What's happened, though, for the banks to try and win your business, they've accepted lower margins. So now their margins are 0.5 to 4%. Still not spectacular. They're still making good margins, but it's better than 0.5 to 5%. So what could happen in the future, and this is what I believe will happen, as interest rates move up, that's happening because the property market is in full swing. The Bank of England are trying to calm things down. And if the property market is in full swing, then it also means there's probably more buy-to-let lenders out there and more products again, because these lenders will want a bigger piece of the pie. Will interest rates, let's say if they move up 2%, will they go from 4% to 6%, the new products? I say no. What I actually think will happen is the competition will eat up those margins. So the interest rates may go to 2.5%, but products still could be at 4 to 5% still. Now, if you're on a tracker rate and you're on a long-term tracker, then that's not going to go in your favour because you've got to get out and into a new product. But I believe the new products in a couple of years' time won't be that much more expensive than they are today. Now, that's just my opinion. I've based that opinion on what's happened before and what seems to be the trend already happening now. So I don't believe buy-to-let products are going to be that much more expensive in a year or two, even if interest rates have moved up slightly. We shall see. But that's what I predict, and I do think it will happen.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think if base rate goes up 3%, that doesn't necessarily we're all going to be paying an extra 3% on our mortgages. That's my feeling as well, but who knows? We're just going to have to see. The only certainty about predicting the future is you're going to end up looking silly, I believe is the saying. So we'll see. There's been a lot in this episode. We've covered a heck of a lot. We've talked about the past, the future, the present, all the different things that you need to take into account when making the decision about mortgages. I think the only conclusion we can really draw from this is that it's really worth using a mortgage broker, because leverage is a crucial piece of the property investment puzzle. So it makes sense to get expert help. And you can tell from all the things that we've talked about, there are lots of situations where there are no cut and dried answers. And just paying a small amount to an expert to navigate you through all that, as well as making you savings on your time, which we talked about in the last episode, it also will just give you more confidence that you can talk through your plans with someone who's more knowledgeable than you are, and you can end up getting those decisions right. Really, I think that's the only conclusion we can draw from this.
I agree. Use a broker, and use a broker, more importantly, that understands property investment. Preferably they invest themselves, but if they don't, make sure they work with a lot of investors on a regular basis. So, our resource of the week, Rob, we're going back to tax, because we've mentioned tax many times through the episodes, but this is a really good guide you've managed to find from the HMRC.
Yeah, it's a non-stop party this week, isn't it? We've got tax and mortgages. It is fun for me. I love all this stuff. HMRC have put out their own guide to property tax. So the idea is that they've done this for people who have just started renting out a property and they want to know what the tax aspects of it are. And they've done it all in this kind of e-learning style. So you go on and you get walked through all these different things. There are various exercises as you go along to check that you've understood it. It's all really nicely done. It's basic. If you are an experienced property investor, then you're going to know all this stuff already, but it is quite nicely done. So it's definitely worth checking out if you are newer to it. So maybe if you are just making your first acquisition, and we've heard from lots of people who've left us reviews or emailed us saying how they're just looking for their first property now, or they've actually bought their first property since listening to the podcast, which is always fantastic. We love those. So if you are in that position, this is very much worth checking out. The URL is pretty long and complicated, so we'll just link to it in the show notes, which is thepropertyhub.net/mortgages. And if you want more depth than that, so if you know all the basics and you want a more detailed guide to how you can save money on your taxes, we have got a course in the Property Hub about this, which we put together with a chartered accountant and tax expert, Ian Wallace. He helped us put together a really great course to help you save money on lots of different areas of tax. It costs a little bit of money if you are not a Property Hub Plus member. If you are a Plus member, it's all part of your membership. But I'd say that this is one of those products which is almost certainly going to save you much more than you pay for it, however you pay for it, because it's one of those things where you just need to pick up one thing you didn't previously know about, and you can be saving on your taxes every single year. So it's definitely worth educating yourself about tax, either just the basics, as we've talked about, or going into more depth and seeing how you can save yourself some money. But either way, we've got you covered. The links to both of those are going to be in the show notes.
They certainly are. And next week, we've got another episode that we feel you should definitely listen to, and it's financial lessons you should have been taught at school. So hopefully you've learned them since, but if you haven't, we'll run through them next week. We've based it on an article put together by Martin Lewis. There's some interesting stuff there, but we've added to it as well. And if you then go and learn the lessons, pass it on to the next generation, because I'm really passionate about this, that we should teach financial education at schools. So I believe the country would be in a far better position right now if we did teach financial lessons at school. But I'll get off my soapbox, and I'll talk next week about this. And Rob, you've got some crackers to add to this too, so I think it's going to be a really good episode.
Yeah, it definitely is. So don't miss that next week. Please do join us. Please do leave us an iTunes review if you haven't already. Just go over to the show notes to see how you do that. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. We'll see you again next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.